Romans 12, starting in verse 1. Paul's speaking here, and he's telling the brothers. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." Or I think some translations have, "This is your reasonable service." Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. As we look at those few verses, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. God's mercy. Do we remember that? Remember what He'd done for us, sending His one and only Son. He sacrificed. And in view of that sacrifice, isn't it most reasonable for us to offer ourselves, our bodies, as living sacrifices? His Son died for our sins. He rose again after 3 days. Because of His death and the shedding of His blood, our sins were wiped clean. So wouldn't it be only fitting for us to sacrifice also? Living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Well, now that's a tough one. Because we were born into this world. This world is all around us. And it's so easy to conform. If we've never been raised in the church, we are formed by the world. But it says, do no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think that's where it has to start. You have to make a conscientious decision that you are not going to be like the world. And with God's help, you will be transformed. But we can't just let human nature take over, because we will not be transformed. We will conform to the world. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Do we always know what God's will is? Sometimes it's a mystery. Sometimes we're befuddled. What is your will here, Lord? What is it? But if we are transformed and renewing our mind constantly, it says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. God's will is always perfect, isn't it? Whatever God has in mind for us, according to His will, it's always going to be perfect. Sometimes we don't know what that is. 3 days ago, I didn't know how all this thing was going to work out with Chuck. I mean, it's like, call from Mary Lou on Saturday night, I think it was. We got some problems here. I'm in Elko, Nevada. I need to talk to you now. She calls Jill. We find out what's going on. At that point, I didn't know what God's will was. I didn't know how things were going to work out. But as we look at God's perfect will, how things fell into place, how people were put into play, of how things were related, how people that knew people, all of these things have been working to the good, haven't they? And it says, all things will work for the good for those that love God, correct? And that do His will. We could have thought a jillion different ways of how this could work out, and it wouldn't have worked out as smoothly as it has so far with the kids being taken care of as far as daycare, with things falling into place. We could have put our heads together and never came up with a perfect plan like that. But God has a plan. God has His will in place. And we need to give ourselves to that. We are living sacrifices. And it says, it is our reasonable service. It's only reasonable. For what He has done for us, can we sacrifice a bit? It says we should. Something to think about. As we go throughout our daily lives in this world, how many people do we meet daily that we could strike up a conversation, that we could ask, well, how are you doing today? Then maybe they would be honest enough to say, boy, I'm struggling with this. And we could be there to help them. But we have to do the initial asking. We have to place ourselves in a position of humbleness. Something to think about this week till we meet again on the first day of the week, Sunday, and remember the sacrifice that was given for us. And remember, what is our reasonable sacrifice? What is our reasonable act of worship? Sacrificing ourselves. If there's anyone here that needs to make a decision to follow Christ, or if there's anyone that has a need, let that be known as we stand and sing our closing song.